Welcome to Game Dev, Game Love, a Game Dev London podcast mini-series where I talk to a fellow game developer about a game that they really love, and we discussed it from a game developer's point of view. I'm your host, Quang, from Asobi Tech, and today our game developer guest is...
Hi, I'm Dr. Tommy Thomson. I am a video game developer, researcher, lecturer, and most people know me as a YouTuber because I'm the voice of the YouTube series AI in Games.
Wonderful. Okay, if you want to tell us briefly about your game development history.
Yeah, so it's kind of weird. I've always kind of been surrounded by games and computers ever since I was a kid. Quang and I, you and I have kind of shared history in terms of like old computer systems, which for a lot of other people, you're just going to be like, what are these things? So my first machine in my house was an Amstrad CPC 464. Which, if you're not old enough to remember one of these, they were around in the early 1980s, and one of the big things about it was it had a tape deck, and that's how you played games on it. So if you wanted to play a game, you had to buy the tape, literally the equivalent of like a cassette that you'd get for music. Again, a very outdated notion. But what we do is that you would put the cassette into the machine, you'd prep it, you'd run the command, and then what you do is you just amuse yourself for 15 minutes, and it either loads the game or it doesn't. And so, I used to play a lot of games back then of kind of Dizzy and Chucky Egg and things of that ilk, and then gradually moved into kind of console space and what have you. Always had a love for computers and started to learn to program at an early age. My dad was a software engineer, so I kind of learned from him. Interestingly, I never actually quite figured out how to take the thing I was doing in programming and applying that to games. It's one of those things that now, if I ever look back on my life, I'm pretty sure I squandered the first 15 years of it by not doing more game development. And so I ended up, I used to do a wee bit of game dev. Anyone who remembers the Game Factory software that was out on PC in the 90s, I made a whole bunch of awful stuff that no one in their right mind should ever look at. And a lot of it was infringing on copyrights, because if there's one thing I love more than video games, it's comic books. But I used to make a lot of really bad comic book video games in Games Factory. And then I went to university, I got my computer science degree, and then I actually fell into artificial intelligence. I fell in love with the idea of it and studying that subject matter. So I have a master's degree in AI, and then after that I went and pursued a PhD. And my PhD is specifically in AI in the context of video games and how you can build AI systems that work within video games. And that's kind of been the driving force ever since, and that was about 15 years ago. So since then I graduated, I had my PhD, I've had it for about 10 years now, and then I worked in academia and I taught video game development. I taught video game development purely because I was one of the few lecturers who cared enough about it that I really wanted to invest myself in it, and I thought, I want to teach this, so I'm going to learn. I'd made a lot of bad games by that point. I'd kind of migrated into, during my PhD, I made a lot of bad games in Java applets, which I don't recommend anyone doing. And then as I moved into teaching, I was like, right, I should probably reconnect with what Unreal does. I tried playing around with Unreal Development Kit at one point, so I got into, UDK and UE4, and then I started playing with Microsoft's XNA, and I've made a half a dozen games in that. I loved that tool; it was fantastic. And then sadly, it went away. And then Unity, and I've actually done a lot of work in Unity since. Nowadays, I've done a bunch of work. I've released one full game from start to finish. My friend Matt and I, we put out a game called Sure Footing on Steam about 2 years ago, I think. And in fact, we're actually going through console ports at the moment. So when I'm not doing everything else, right now I'm fighting with Xbox certification and the challenges that come with actually taking your busted game and putting it on a console where they have rules about the quality of the software that you've written, which great experience, actually. It's very useful for me. And nowadays I kind of work as a sort of developer for hire and also as a consultant, which kind of ties into some of my stuff and what. So I've been working on a bunch of other games that I can't tell you about. And so that's pretty much my entire game development career in 5 minutes.
Wonderful. That's great stuff. So let's talk about the game you've chosen to highlight. What's the game and why have you chosen it?
Yeah, so the game I picked was F.E.A.R, or First Encounter Assault Recon. It's a game that was released in 2005. It's developed by Monolith Productions. most people nowadays will know Monolith for the Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games. But so F.E.A.R's been around since 2005, came out on PC, PS3, and Xbox 360. And one of the reasons that I picked it is I really like it as a first-person shooter. I think it's a great game. Interestingly, I don't like it that much. If I actually was to list, it's in my top 10 favourite FPSs probably, but it's definitely not in my top 5. But it's actually very important to me personally and professionally because pretty much, like I said, my interest in artificial intelligence for video games, I did my PhD in that area, I studied that area, and then subsequently I've done a lot of, I now work as a consultant in this space. I have a YouTube show that I spend far too much time on, that fortunately people watch now, which is great, because for the first 3 years. But it all starts with that game. My PhD is influenced by that game. The subject of my PhD is based partially on a reaction to that game. The very first episode of AI in games is F.E.A.R, and it's a really interesting story about the technology that exists in that game and what it's trying to do at that point in time in game development history, if you will. And subsequently, I think it's an interesting one to talk about because whenever you see best AI in video game top 10 lists that Pop Culture or something put together, more often than not, F.E.A.R will still be in there, and that game's 15 years old. So I thought, yeah, that'd be a great one to talk about.
That's great. This podcast is all about what you love in games and obviously game design. And as a game developer, you look at games differently from the average person, shall we say. I think another friend of mine, he's a producer in movies, and every time we go to the movies together, he can't appreciate the movie just for watching it. He will pick it apart and just tear it apart, and it's really difficult to go watch movies with because of this. But I think this is for game developers to discuss game development. Yeah,
I think that's it. So many. How often do you ever I can't. It's very rare now that I play a game and I get lost in just enjoying it. More often than not, I'll begin to, what is it and that's it. We all do it. We all pull that thread. What's the thing? I'm liking this. Why am I liking this? What is it about this? It's this thing. Okay, let's pull on that thread and find out why did that happen. And then, I've always been that kind of curious person. I actually probably would really like to meet your film producer friend because I spend a lot of time. I do the YouTube show. People watch my videos because they're interested in the inner workings of these games. I watch movie YouTube shows because I'm interested in the inner workings of film, but I don't have a background in film. So I'm somebody tell me what it is I'm feeling that I don't understand. So I don't know. Maybe we're helping. Who knows?
I'm the same thing. When I watch movies, I now go watch documentaries about the makings of those movies because I like to understand it. And I think there is a huge overlap between movies and games as a medium of storytelling. So it does help with that, definitely.
I think it's about respecting the craft because it's particularly a lot of these big productions, games, films, whatever. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of people worked on it. And so being able to understand these were actually people that developed this. They put a lot of time and money into this. And then just simply being able to appreciate, right, so this tiny little thing that I love, that took 3 people 2 years to get right. Or something completely bizarre like that. Or it was a panic thing. They were we couldn't get it to work and we fudged it 6 months before launch and hey, it worked. I love that. Just sort of, it speaks to the reality of how anarchic this sort of creative pursuit is.
Taking it back to F.E.A.R. So F.E.A.R, you say that is an FPS shooter.
Yeah.
But it's not your favourite FPS shooter. Which would you say is your top 3 favourite FPS shooters?
Titanfall 2, Doom, and the 2016 reboot of Doom. That's not a difficult one to answer. Cause and effect. Cause and effect. The level in Titanfall 2 is probably one of the greatest levels in video game history, and the fact that they didn't then make an entire game around it, a little bit sad every day.
Okay, so F.E.A.R. What are the things in F.E.A.R. that you love the most?
So, to kind of get an understanding of how the game works, it's a survival, it's a weird kind of horror first-person shooter. So the idea is that you play as this character called the Point Man, who is part of this, who's just joined this strategic combat unit F.E.A.R, First Encounter Assault Recon. And there's something weird going on involving psychic, telepathically commanded soldiers and some crazy psychic dude who you need to go and kill. Video games. And you start to investigate this series of weird disturbances. And what happens is it's a game that kind of oscillates between two extremes. So it's all about weird, creepy horror moments where you seem to be repeatedly seeing what looks like a young girl in a red gown. Very much kind of ripping off like Ringu, like the Japanese horror movies of that era. And then you'll have the creepy horror bit. So quiet, bang! And then 10 minutes later, you get into these situations where you're fighting groups of soldiers. Now, the reason I love it is that the soldiers themselves, it uses a particular form of artificial intelligence that was developed specifically. Well, in the context of video games, it was developed specifically for this game. But in the wider world, it wasn't. And that's actually why it's really interesting to me, because it's adapting something that already existed in the wider world and put it into video games. And it achieves... And one of the things that I really loved about it is that it was the first game first time I really understood the idea that AI in video games is about performance theatre. So, you see it everywhere, right? Nowadays, AI exists everywhere. It's in your phone, it's in your house, it's in your, I don't know, whatever kitchen appliance that you might have. We now talk to Alexas and Siri on our phone or what have you. And we use Google Maps, we use all these different systems around the world now that are designed as AI tools. Excuse me. And one of the things about that is that AI is always designed with the intention of creating optimal solutions to problems. But that doesn't work in video games, because an optimal solution to a problem is that AI just turns around, shoots you in the head, and you're dead. So you never really want that, because it's just going to take away from the power fantasy. And enough action games are built on this principle that we want the player to feel good about themselves and to make them feel like they're powerful, even when if we actually turned the dial up, they wouldn't be. So it's actually more about creating a dramatic performance where you want characters to make intelligent decisions that create fun experiences and make it really cool for the player. And that moment of, oh my god, because this character's jumped out of cover, or they maybe thrown a grenade at you, or they flank, or they're talking to each other to share advice on how to proceed, and you're freaking out. You're like, oh wow, they're talking to each other, they're learning, this is great, and you're constantly trying to shoot them the whole time. And I think that was because it was the first time I really got to understand the inner workings of a game, and that understanding of performance theatre versus optimality, which has then kind of driven my hunger to learn more about AI in video games ever since.
So I think my first experience with AI that I recognised as AI in a FPS would probably be Halo.
Right.
When the grunts started running away, or they reacted to you being there, calling their friends over and things like that. How does the AI in Halo compare to the AI in F.E.A.R?
So there's, if you look at sort of the early 2000s, we're in this kind of interesting space, late 90s, early 2000s, where fully 3D first-person shooters or fully 3D gaming is coming about. And we're moving into this period where all these things that were actually, I wouldn't say easy, but less complicated in a 2D environment. Sort of having characters move around spaces, knowing how to move around obstacles, how to make good decisions and react within that space. Those were relatively easier in a 2D world. When you moved into 3D, everything became more complicated. How do you even figure out how to walk from here to there without tripping over something? Like, how do you recognize that there's something in the way that blocks you? And so there's a lot of games through the late 90s into the early 2000s that are kind of pivotal moments in artificial intelligence for game development. Off the top of my head, Quake 3 Arena, very important. It was essentially where navigation, what we now call a navigation mesh, that was essentially conceived part of the development of Quake 3. GoldenEye, and in turn Half-Life. So GoldenEye and Half-Life essentially did kind of the same thing. They both use a technique that we now refer to as finite state machines, where you have a character that's in a particular situation. And what it does is it's always doing that thing. Maybe it's just patrolling around a space, and then it reacts to something. There's some sort of external stimulus in the world, like, hey, the player just walked in front of you. And so it transitions into the player's in front of me, like a reaction behavior, or it will maybe like bring the gun up to fire. Halo's the next big one. So after, like you say, you had GoldenEye and Half-Life, and it's like I found out in my own research that Half-Life actually was influenced slightly by GoldenEye. Shameless plug, go watch my GoldenEye video. Then it gets into Halo. So Halo originally used a similar thing to Half-Life, but they kind of evolved it and mutated it between Halo 1 and Halo 2. And that became what is now known as behavior trees, which I'd say about 60% of like AAA games, behavior trees for their AI. It's the tool if you use Unreal Engine. That is the default AI tool now built into Unreal Engine 4. It's very much kind of became a standard. So Halo 2 was 2004. F.E.A.R comes out the following year, and it was the other major innovation. And there wasn't really, that was the last big one for quite a while, because it was introducing this alternative approach to behavior trees, what it's referred to as goal-oriented action planning, or GOAP for short. So GOAP in F.E.A.R, because apparently just 4-letter acronyms were just the way to go when they made this game.
It's like it's the next level up from TLAs, those 3-letter acronyms.
Yeah, they're just like, right, we need to have one more. And because the thing is about a good acronym is it also should spell out something. GOAP doesn't. GOAP sounds like some sort of medicinal product that you buy off the internet. Going to get myself a couple of buckets of GOAP. Hang on, isn't that what's Gwyneth Paltrow's thing? Like Goop?
Oh, Goop.
Goop.
Yeah,
Apparently, my wife just shouted from the other room, "Goop!" I'm like, okay, thank you. Close enough.
So, so you're saying, so F.E.A.R is like the next step in evolution from Halo.
I wouldn't say it's like the next step up. It's sort of the alternative approach you could take. So I guess that the hard part is to kind of actually explain how each of these works. So if you think behavior trees are a tree, if you think about it as an actual tree structure, you always start at the top of the tree, and based on, is the player close to me? No. Okay. Are they out? Can I see them? Could I maybe attack them in some way? Yes. Do I have a grenade? Yes, I'll throw a grenade at them. Or no, I don't have a grenade, but I do have ammo in my gun. Okay, I'll maybe just stand here and shoot at the player. And that was one of the big things that they did with Halo, was the different parts of the tree were contextual. So I'm in a vehicle. Okay, if I'm not in a vehicle, I can do all this stuff. But if I'm in a vehicle, I have to do this stuff. But also they could dynamically force change in the world. So one of the most well-known examples in Halo is if you shoot one of the elites in the head. If you kill an elite in proximity of a lot of the grunts panic. And this is what they refer to as a stimulus behavior, which is now actually very common in behavior tree design. At the time, it wasn't. And so the idea is that when they kill it, they fire an event into the behavior tree of all the grunts. And it says this thing has changed, and then that forces them to change from being, all the way down in this corner of the tree to being all the way over here, where they're now saying, God, I'm going to panic now because the player's dead. The player's killed the elite. GOAP was different, and what F.E.A.R did is it actually takes an existing technique in artificial intelligence called automated planning, and it adapts it in the context of video games. Now, planning is all about figuring out what you want to do and in what order you want to do, and then you figure out how to make that actually work. Now, the funny thing about it is planning is not a new thing. So when people are really excited about, this game, it does all these things, it's planning, these characters are reacting and they're making intelligent decisions. It's based on a technology that's been around since about the mid-1970s. It's if you look at things like the Mars rover or any kind of lunar landers that we've built, like robots that have went out into space, they use the same technology. Because what it's all about is sitting there and thinking, this is my knowledge of the world. I need to plan out what I'm going to do for the next 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours. And then it will come up with a plan. Now, these plans are very abstract. It's I'm going to go over there, do this thing, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to go over here, and then I'll maybe do something else. So like for a robot, for example, if it's out in the moon, drive over there, take some photographs, I'm going to grab some rock samples, then I should have just enough battery to get me back to the station, and I'll recharge my battery and I'll wait. And the reason they had to do this is completely out the scope of the game, but this is actually really important to explain before we get into the game. The reason they used to do this was that, when they have rovers up on the moon or Mars or whatever, they lose it for hours at a time. because the planets are constantly spinning, so they lose radio contact. So what they're doing is they give the robot goals, and they tell it, okay, well, we're not going to be able to speak to you for another like 12 hours and change. So in between them, do us a favour, get a bunch of photographs, get some rock samples, don't die, and we'll catch up with you like afterwards. And so that's what it would do, is that they would lose radio contact, and then the robot would be like, okay, I have a plan. Go off, and it'll do all the things, and then they'd reconvene afterwards, and it'd go, hey, like the plan worked, or the plan didn't work, and this is where I am right now, what do I do? Now, that's interesting because it doesn't tell it how to do it, it just tells it what to do and when to do it. The how is interesting, and actually for F.E.A.R, that's also really cool. So what they did is they applied the same principle. So GOAP uses a version of what is called STRIPS, STRIPS, which actually stands for the Stanford Research Institute Problem Solver, which was a planning system developed in 1976, if I remember right. That's the predecessor to everything I'm just talking about with rovers. So what they did was they said, right, let's take that idea and put it in a video game. All the enemy characters that you see in F.E.A.R, what they do is they are trying to figure out at that point in time what is a good thing for them to do. And they can do a patrol around the environment. Maybe they see the player and they realise, actually, patrolling's for losers. I'm gonna this guy. Or I'm about to die, I need to do something about this. So they create these goals for themselves, and if I remember right, there's like 90 actions. I think there's about 40 goals in the game that they can give themselves to do. And then it says, right, I'm going to do this goal. Okay, now I need to figure out how to do it. So they have about 90 different actions they can do. So they can run around the environment, they can jump over things, they can hide behind cover, they can throw grenades, they can blind fire, they can jump up and fire, they can rush the player and try and fire. So they have all these different actions that are available to them, and what they figure out is what is a good combination of these actions that will create a good plan of attack. And what it does is they're told don't die, which I always think is a really interesting thing, because usually if you think about a video game design, if you want a bad guy to kill the player, you tell it kill the player. But it doesn't. What they tell it is just don't die. Figure out how not to die, because apparently fighting for their life is a very interesting thing to see happen in a video game. Particularly also because this is a first-person shooter, so they have a lifespan of, 6 seconds, depending on the situation. And so, yeah, what they did is sort of adapted this principle of give the AI enough an understanding of its world, so it knows where it is and it knows what's near it. It's like, all right, there's a table here and there's like a window there, okay, and players there, and I have some ammo in my gun. What's the good thing for me to do here? So I could knock the table over and hide behind it. I could jump in through the window, and these are all perfectly valid things. These are things that happen in F.E.A.R. Like you'll see a guard just yell, oh, expletive, because they've saw the player, and then jump through a window, and then blind fire from behind the window, from like underneath. And so it's giving them this flexibility. And one of the crazy things is, as soon as you put a couple of those characters in the same space, it just kicks off. It just looks crazy. It's manic. So every fight always, all these different, and it's very similar to other shooters. It creates these little environments, these little tactical puzzles, kind of combat chess, if you will, and then the characters are just scrambling around trying to find some way to stay alive. And it still to this day, like I replayed it recently because I did a video where I revisited the game. Like it still surprises me, and it still catches me off guard at times, which is great. It's kind of what you want.
So I think this is quite similar how they do it in Pac-Man, where you have the 4 different ghosts, and they all have their own version of an AI. They don't follow the same patterns, otherwise they all group and clump together. But because they all have their own functionalities and their own goals, as it were, they act differently. And having one ghost is fine, you can predict that. But as soon as you layer in another ghost, and then another ghost, and then another ghost, it has all these different layers, and the level of complexity is exponential. And it's incredible to see, again, even though it's very simple AI, by layering more than one of them into the fold, it gets a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and also there's the unknown of all of it. Like so, particularly in Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, you don't have to learn eventually how the ghosts are thinking. So Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde in the original, they all have very specific behaviors. They're all hardwired behaviors. That's a whole other podcast episode we could get into. But one of the things that's really interesting about Ms. Pac-Man is the element of randomness. So it's actually the same code they replied with Sue, but their behaviors are exactly the same. But the one thing that changes is when they get to a junction, they can do their usual AI like behavior, or they can do something random. And it's actually from a scientific, technical perspective, it changes the problem from being a deterministic problem to a non-deterministic. That's why, particularly when you look at like pro players who play Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man in arcades, the score differences are massive because you predict what's going to happen in Pac-Man, you can't predict what's going to happen in Ms. Pac-Man. And so, yeah, that non-determinism, that randomness, is always great because it just keeps you on your toes. Like, oh, hang on, there was another character. Where did he go? Ah, he's behind. Ah, and then that's it. Like you're getting shot at from behind, or they're throwing a grenade at your head or something.
And how's that done in F.E.A.R. then? Obviously they have their goals, but how random are their choices?
So each of the different character types has different actions available to it. So there's the standard soldiers who you fight a lot. There's kind of heavies. There are like ninja assassin characters. I don't know, like. You fight them, they're kind of cool. They make no sense, and again, the game. But all of them have different actions they can do. So, for example, the heavies can't. The heavies can't like knock over tables to create cover. They can't jump through windows because they're too heavy. But also, they don't care about hiding in cover because they're big armored characters. Whereas the smaller ones are more inclined. The stealth ninjas, they don't use cover either. But they have other abilities that the other characters don't have. So by creating, and the way it works is the planning system says, okay, for this character to be able to do this action, it has to be in this situation. And if it does that, this will be the effect. We call this in AI planning, it's called preconditions and effects. So in order for me to say I want a drink here of my nondescript orange liquid, because can't have product placement. If I'm going to pick this up from the table, for example, in order for me to drink it, I need to be able to pick it up. So in order for that to work, it has to be on the table. So is the glass of juice on the table? Yes. Okay. Am I thirsty? Yeah. Okay, great. So the preconditions are that it's available. The action is then that I drink it. The effect is that I've actually quenched my thirst, but also the amount of fluid available in that container is reduced. And so the system's constantly monitoring this. Like, what is the state of the world versus what the characters think the state of the world is? They figure out all the actions they want to do. And like I say, depending on the character, they have different actions available to them. Like, weird, dumb fact is that, like I said, there's like psychic soldiers, there's ninja assassins, there's heavies, there's like weird psychic ghosts that you fight in the last quarter of the game. It's a whole thing. I'd have to explain the story. Yeah. But like the rats. So like a lot at the start of the game, you're in like derelict buildings and you see rats scurrying about everywhere. Exactly this. They all use the same system. The rats only have two abilities: can stand still or move. And so the rats, they use the same planning tech, and all they do is go, I need to go somewhere. What's my plan? I'm going to go over there, stand still. And then either a timer runs out or the player tries to shoot at the rat and they go, oh, I need to plan again. So it's depending on... And I think that's really interesting because as soon as you realise that the rats are using the same tech, it's like, oh, right. So all it's missing is what affordances are given to each character. So if they'd actually given the rats the ability to jump through windows and knock over cover or attack you, then it would have been a completely different game. Might have had a couple of janky animations in there.
I think I want to play that game.
I know, I want to play that game too. They completely screwed it up when they made like 2 sequels after this, and they just went the completely wrong direction. They're like, we're going to lean into the soldier thing. Like, we're fighting super ninja rats, please.
Obviously, as a game, the AI is such an important thing. You know, people talk about it over and over again. When I was doing research for this, people's videos and reviews of the game would always reference your video. Like your video is now the go-to video about the AI in F.E.A.R, which is amazing. And for a game to be known so heavily for its AI, does it have any other redeeming qualities?
Like one of the things one of the things that I think is both a plus and a minus is that the pacing of it's really interesting, because it's the first time I can really think of a shooter game that tries to make you feel uncomfortable and on edge at all times. Like I said, it's actually a horror game, but it's also a horror game where you have a tremendous amount of agency and power. You're still like, one of the things I haven't really talked about is that one of the core mechanics of the game is that it does slow-mo. And I'm pretty sure that's because the Matrix films were in vogue around that. At least the Matrix trilogy had ended, I think, by the time... Yeah, that's right. The Matrix trilogy had ended by the time F.E.A.R came out. So you can... One of the main mechanics is the player can hit a button and it... And I think this is interesting kind of reaction to the AI. So the AI is quite ruthless. The game is designed to have a lot of jump scares and a lot of really awkward atmosphere. And a lot of the game doesn't take place in pretty environments. Like, you start in like warehouses, sewage plant at one point, and you end up in derelict office buildings. It's always dark and decrepit, settling. And it's interesting because it does this thing of balancing your sense of power with your sense of selflessness, of powerlessness, actually. So you go in, you wipe out 20 guys in a big fight, and you go, oh wow, that was actually really good, I had fun doing that, I can't believe I survived that. And then you walk around the corner and that creepy little girl is standing 20 feet away from you, and then you have some creepy hallucination, and maybe like the walls start bleeding, start seeing weird things, and then you flash out of it and the little girl's gone. So it constantly does this thing of making you feel like you're just holding on and no more. And I think that's I think that's also one of the interesting things about it, because there's not many, like I say, like first-person shooters, like video games in general, tend to be power fantasy. Not many first-person shooters that are built around horror. Like subsequently, you now have all these other horror games, whether it's like Amnesia or Outlast or Alien Isolation and stuff like that, where you feel powerless the whole time. Whereas here, they're still giving you that agency. Then it just when you're beginning to feel good about yourself, it just takes it back off you. It goes, no. Felt good there, but don't worry. There's still the creepy little girl around the corner who's maybe going to kill you. Don't know.
So I have to say, when you talk about slow motion in games, I was a big fan of the Max Payne games, and having that bullet time as you jump around the corner, firing double pistols was so much fun. Obviously, as you say, the Matrix was a big part of that. And while doing my research for F.E.A.R, I saw they had this, the melee attack is a sort of jumping bicycle kick.
Yeah.
Tell me about this.
Yeah, so it's one of those weird little things, because the standard melee attack is you can just kind of like hit someone with the butt of the rifle, but then you can kind of kick people as well if you jump, but then it kind of goes a little bit Liu Kang if you manage to do it during the slow-mo. And I have to admit, I don't do it that often, but it's kind of weird when you think about it. You're just like, why not? And just like I actually kind of forget about it until you brought it up. It just seems so out of place at times. Like, why is this in there? Because I'm pretty sure you can't do it in F.E.A.R 2 or 3 either. Like, they forgot. They're like, we'll just take that out. I don't know what we were thinking.
So I understand also F.E.A.R has 2 expansion packs. One of them good, one of them not so much. So
the weird thing about F.E.A.R is actually how the sequels panned out as well. So one of the interesting things was that the original F.E.A.R was built, so it's published by Warner Brothers, or it was published by Sierra, sorry. The original game was published by Sierra, or Vivendi. Oh, sorry.
Vivendi, yeah.
Vivendi.
Yeah.
Vivendi, Warner Brothers then bought up the rights to it. So they had this really successful game, like F.E.A.R was really popular. It still gets sold quite frequently. It was doing really well, and they wanted to make a sequel, but Monolith didn't have the rights to the sequel. So it's one of those stories that now you think about it, it's like, how often does this happen? So a studio goes out its way and it says, they actually came out and said it, like, we don't have the rights to the game, because people were like, where's the sequel to F.E.A.R? We really want a sequel. And they said, we actually don't have the rights to it. So we are going to make our own game, which is going to be something of a spiritual successor to this game that seems markedly similar because we're going to put creepy little girls in it and we're going to have slow motion attacks and full AI, but it has no reference to the F.E.A.R brand. It's called Project Origin. And then they worked on that for about a year or two, I think, or at least it was out in the wild for about a year or so. They were actually properly bigging it up and advertising it as Project Origin, which is a reference to the scientific experiment that they do that creates the creepy girl. And a whole bunch of other stuff. Again, trying to explain the plot of these games is kind of ridiculous. And what happened was eventually Warner Brothers turned around, because I think Warner Brothers started trying to get someone to start making F.E.A.R 2 internally, and they're not getting anywhere with it. And so they eventually turned around and said, hey, we'd like you to come on board and we'll actually properly publish this and you can make part of the F.E.A.R franchise. Oh yeah, that's it. Project Origin, the name was crowdsourced from their fan base. This is in 2007 or something.
Who does this?
Like, hearing that now, like, you know, that you went on Twitch and you ran a poll or something, or you went on Twitter and then like you're like, hey, we don't have the rights to Call of Duty, what are we going to call the next game? And everyone's like, oh, we're going to call it Gunny McGunface. And they're like, right, cool, fine. That's what the Kickstarter audience has picked. We're going to call it Gunny McGunface, and they just go ahead with it. Like, that sounds like something that's very 2020. But the idea that happened around that period was kind of nuts. And so yeah, there's like this weird thing that you can play. There are 5 games. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 entries in the F.E.A.R franchise. F.E.A.R, Perseus Mandate, Extraction Point, F.E.A.R 2 and F.E.A.R 3, and F.E.A.R Online, which came out in like 2014, which has none of the actual things that anyone remembers F.E.A.R for. It's an online shooter, and I feel like they missed the mark on that one.
Yeah.
But only 2 of them were actually made by Monolith. It's the first, it's F.E.A.R and F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin. It's one of those weird it's an IP dying for a reboot, I think, at this point. But at least just somebody to make it for more than 2 entries without on it with each other.
Well, so talking about reboot, if you were to make a F.E.A.R game, what would you do differently?
Actually, like, funnily enough, most of my gripes with F.E.A.R aren't down with the AI. Pacing is actually my biggest issue. The game's too damn long. It's one of those games that I think the levels are... It's right, so this is something that you and I can appreciate because we're both old. That thing where, particularly back when we started doing 3D, this idea, we have 3D modeling tool, we can build 3D maps, and everybody made the biggest levels imaginable. And, you know, you go back to like Unreal, or, you know, that game that they named the engine after kids. I actually that to a class not that long ago, and they didn't realise Unreal Engine's named after Unreal. I nearly died. Or like Halo. Halo's a good example of that. Like, I know people love that, but like if you lose your warthog or whatever, that's a long walk in an awful lot of those Halo. Really hope this blooming giant power weapon in space doesn't detonate while I'm still trying to run across it for 35 minutes. So yeah, it's from that era where first-person shooter levels take an hour to finish. And you're so, okay, how many levels is there? Oh, there's 18. Oh god, right, okay. I'll come back to this tomorrow. And yeah, the pacing of it's all over the place, I think. I think in terms of... I think what it does in terms of combat is actually pretty solid. What I'd be interested to see is how well you can adapt or change that now, because we've kind of... So they really... one of the things, I always find it really interesting that the slow-mo in that game feels like it's built as a way to give you a leg up on the fact that the AI is now so good that players in general really struggle with it. And it's kind of convenient that they built a story reason for it. Again, long an explanation. But there's a story reason why you can do slow-mo and nobody else in the game can. And that felt like an interesting reaction. But you look at games like Doom, the more recent reboot of Doom, where the power, the agency given to the player is massive. So now, and they build this whole thing on this principle that you're a killing machine. More so than any other game. And the fact that all the demons are generally scared of. And I really like how that came up with this idea that the demons actually run tubes at push forward combat, as they call it, when they the 2016 game. I'd be interested to see what happens if the characters in F.E.A.R were more ruthless, because they actually tend to play more in the defensive. So it might be even you'll see like 3-4 of them in a room, out like contact, and then they all start fanning out into cover and they go and hide or whatever. Like, I'd be more interested to see what happens if they actually are more aggressive in fighting back, and see whether or not, like, is that something that you can balance and make fun?
Do you think the reason they're more defensive is that their primary objective is to stay alive, and they think hiding and taking cover rather than pushing forward and attacking is the best way to stay alive?
Yeah, so each of them kind of calculates like the priority they have of what goal they should do at that point in time, and it's based on the information they have in the world. So say for example, if they're out in the open and the player is aiming in their general direction, the system that calculates all this is telling them, buddy, you're in a bad spot right now. You need to do something about this right now. And so it looks at what's available to it, and like you say, like, it's interested in its own survival. So ducking behind cover is just as valuable as running at the player and shooting at them. It's like, I've maybe got a chance here, but also it might be that it's in an open area, so I don't have anywhere to go and cover. The only thing I can do at this point is start running in that direction and kind of blind firing in the direction of the player and hoping upon hope I don't die. And I think that, like, I like that sense of preservation. I guess that's the counterpoint to my earlier point, because the thing in Doom is that they have any sort of enthusiasm for mortality, whereas here they are worried about it. It always seems odd though that they do that. Surely if there's 4 of them, they're like, what are we doing? Turn, run away from this guy. Everybody, just shoot him with your guy. There we go, he's dead, no problem. But no, they all kind of fan out and what have you. And I mean, one of the thing is that's so good about it is an awful lot of what you think is happening is entirely nonsense. The game likes to tell you things. It communicates information to the player in a way that you think you understand what's happening, but it ties back into this whole performance theory. So one of the things it does very well, which Call of Duty 2 really helped pioneer this, the barking system. All the characters shout at each other. So like I said, if you come round the corner, one of them will yell, "Contact!" and then the rest of them all fan out. If one of them throws a grenade, he'll tell you he's throwing a grenade. If one of them decides to get to cover, he might yell, "I'm getting into cover." Or another character might tell him, "You're exposed, get to cover." And then you'll see them like dive behind a table. Now, you're sitting there thinking, what? He just told him to do that. And they do it with flanking maneuvers as well. So one of them's maybe hiding behind cover and he's taking shots at you, and then he kind of yells to the other guy, "Flank him!" And you'll see another character run round. And you're like, they're talking to each other. Ah! And that's where the slow-mo kicks in, because you're standing looking at this guy. This guy's flanking round here. So you're like, ooh. Blowing him away.
Again, when I was doing the research, one of the things I saw is that the enemies aren't actually aware of each other's positionings.
Right.
It's the bark system that gives them commands and
they have no idea
information.
Yeah, and it's this whole thing of smoke and mirrors, as I call it. Like 50% of good AI in a video game is a smart system. The other 50% is how you fudge it so it looks a lot smarter to the player than it actually is. And so what happens there is that's 2 characters individually making a decision. Actually, it's a team management system that sits above all the characters. So no enemy character in the game has any understanding of any other character in the world except the player. As far as they're concerned, it's a one-on-one. And the only thing that the only time they're ever actually made aware, but that's nonsense. That's not how it works. They can't move into locations that other characters are standing in, because somebody's standing there, and it'll look really weird if you go up and start kind of like rubbing yourself against them. Particularly right now, we're implementing social distancing, so we ain't having that. And what happens is the game decides this team management system at the top says, right, we're going to do a flanking move, and it goes, okay, you'd be good for a flank. You're not good for a flank, but you're within spitting distance of this guy. Okay, cool. You do the blind fire and yell a line that says you're going to flank. So he's like, okay, flank him. And then it's synced up, so it goes, right, when you go to say that line of dialogue, I want you to go over there, like you're doing a flanking behaviour. And it actually doesn't tell them it's a flank. It just says move into this location, because their sensors will pick up that when they see the player again, and they go, I've now walked in front of the player. Bullets! I'm just going to shoot him, because why not? But they'll also have a line of dialogue. So when he's like, flank him, the other one goes, flanking! And so, yeah, it's all designed with this intent of making you think that they're talking to each other, then they're making this tactical decision together. Or not. Like, it's the same thing if you throw a grenade at them. Or actually, if one of them's in a good position to throw a grenade, he'll decide he's going to throw a grenade. But the system will say, you know what would be great? Jeff, tell Dave to throw a grenade. Alright, okay. Throw a grenade! And Dave's back over here, and he's like, that's a great idea. I'll throw a grenade. He made that decision on his own. And the game just says, would you say some dialogue to kind of sell these theatrics? But the player's going, oh my god! They're communicating, they're sharing, they're learning together. And it's the simplest trick in the book.
Yeah, it's the smallest things, yeah.
And it's one of those things that I still love to this day, that I look up the inner workings of a game, and it's like, how does that work? And they go, we just fudged it. We just did this. Like, I'm literally preparing the next episode of the YouTube show. I just finished research on the next episode today, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in it where it's like, oh yeah, we couldn't really figure out how to make that work, so we just did this.
So, ages ago, I wrote a driving game, like Micro Machines, overhead view with AI. Well, I say AI, but with other CPU controlled characters.
Yeah.
And basically, you put points around the track, and it follows around the track, which is fine because it goes around, but they all drive around in a line. And you vary their speeds and stuff, so it looks like they're going at different speeds. But it's very boring because all follow the same line. But what I did then, at each point, I gave it 2 points. You could either choose to go to. So each checkpoint, there, it'd be 2 points. It will swap, alternate. So at any one point, the CPU would switch over to one of the points it wanted to go to, and that made them weave in and out of each other. And because there was more than one AI, so more than one CPU, it looked like they were smart and they were working at what they were doing.
Do you know how they actually did it in the old Micro Machines games?
No, I don't actually know.
So the old Micro Machines, top down 2D. If you're under the age of about 25, you're going to have to go and Google this. What they did is every map is actually just an X by Y grid. They make it unit size, so every tile, they break up the whole racetrack, not just the track itself, but the entire level is just a tiled grid. Each tile has a direction on it. And what the CPU does is it goes, what direction should I be moving in if I'm on this tile? So all the tiles that are on the racetrack follow the race ribbon. All the tiles that are not on the racetrack point back towards the race ribbon.
Yeah,
that's how they did it. And it's like, because again, it's one of those things you go, man, that was really cool in like 19 Oatcake, whenever that game, 92. I'm going to commit a cardinal sin. I'm actually going to look up.
I'm going to say early 90s, maybe even a little bit earlier, maybe 91, even 1990 even.
Yeah, 1991 was the original one for the Nintendo Entertainment System. But yeah, that's how they do it. They just put arrows underneath the environment. They just go that way. Yeah, and it's like so you kind of came to the same solution on your own.
Yeah, in a kind of roundabout way, it's like, how do you keep it simple? But I say by giving them 2 points to choose from, it adds a level of complexity that makes them look a lot smarter than they actually are, rather than just following around a single line. And it's just amazing. You add one more layer, and it adds so much more.
Yeah, and a lot of it is also just good work with design teams. So a lot of I haven't really talked a lot about, like I said, like planning. It figures out what to do and in what order. It doesn't actually figure out how to do it. So that's a whole other thing really to get into. But we're already quite far into this conversation. I don't think it's worth going back and talking about that. We'll watch my videos on. Fine.
Definitely.
But one of the interesting things is that that's where designers come in really handy, because they create all these interactable objects. So, hey, there's an interactable object. So, hey, when the character thinks knock over cover, it might be a giant like wooden box. It might be a table. It might be something else. And so that's where the designers are creating all these really interesting spaces work within. So they have all these points of cover that they can use. There's interactable objects and stuff like that. And I think that's really great, because once you get all those things together, it kind of creates this combinatorial explosion of like interesting opportunities. Like I interviewed David Doak last year for an episode on GoldenEye. One of the things we talked about for a little bit was the exploding monitors in that game. And one of the big things they said was they toyed around with that so much. And they had this system where if like the time that it would take to explode had some random range within it, the explosion had some random range within it. So some of them you'd blow it up and it's kind of, and then others. But they also came up with this idea of if it explodes and we know that there's any other monitor within proximity based on the navigation data they have, make them blow up on a delay. And so it creates these kind of systemic chaining of explosions of things. And it's funny because we were kind of talking about it. I'm like, that's systemic game design. You've essentially, like, which is essentially what the Far Cry franchise is built on, this idea of crazy stuff happens and it's down to you. Oh my God, you actually did that 10 years earlier or whatever.
Yeah.
In their own, just purely just so that they could blow up monitors and occasionally kill the odd scientist.
Tommy, it's been great having you along for this chat. I've learnt a lot about AI here, and it's great to discuss it with you directly rather than just watch your videos. But I suggest everyone go watch these videos because they're amazing. Is there anything you're working on at the moment that you want to highlight?
So actually, today, which will be before. This will come out after
I don't know
today.
when this is going out.
I was going to say, this episode comes out after today. So today I just released a new episode on the design pillars of stealth AI, and specifically I looked at Splinter Cell Blacklist. This is actually something of a continuation of a theme at the moment. So episode 50. Amazingly, I've been doing this for 50 episodes and people still watch them. So in the 50th episode, I went and revisited my most popular topic I've ever done, which is alien isolation, which is funny because then people go in the comments and go, you should do a video about fear. I'm like, mate, where have you been? I've done 3. So yeah, we did alien isolation. That was 2 weeks ago. And then I got out Splinter Cell Blacklist. At the end of June, I am going to be doing a episode on The Last of Us, which is so the episodes are voted for by my crowdfunding audience. Pocket Gamers Connect, which is running starting I think 8th of June. I am going to be on a panel there talking about artificial intelligence applications for video games. And what else? Keep an eye out on the Xbox store in the coming months, as we are going to be releasing Sure Footing there, which is, again, a game that I developed, as well as we're going to be doing a huge update to the PC build, hopefully a Nintendo Switch version later in the year.
Amazing. I get a feeling this episode will probably go out after the 8th of June, but I
feel sorry for whoever has to edit it now, because now they're on a time. It's like, sorry mate, we've put you on this really tight schedule.
Where can people find more information about you?
Yeah, if you want to find, if you just want to listen to my voice more, check out AI in Games. So just Google for AI in Games on YouTube. And you'll find me. I'm also at AIinGames.com. I'm on Twitter at AIinGames. So that's no ampersands in there because that doesn't work. So it's AIANDGAS. I also have my own personal Twitter at Get to the Chopper if you have any desire to get to listen to a Scottish guy ramble about things that are annoying him. So it's pretty much AI in games is all the science and all the games without the politics. And if you want the politics in dank memes, then you follow me on Get to the Chopper.
Dank memes. We know.
I know the kids. Kids talk about dank memes. I'm pushing 40, but I know what dank memes are.
Well, thank you again, Tommy, for coming along and chatting about F.E.A.R.